Late 1814. Washington, D.C. still smoldered after the British attack. Government buildings were blackened ruins, morale across the United States had collapsed, and many feared the Republic itself might not survive another year. With Napoleon finally defeated in Europe, the British Empire could now focus far more attention on North America. In late August, Governor-General George Prevost marched south from Canada into New York with a reinforced British army. British leaders believed many Federalists in New England secretly opposed the war strongly enough that they might support Britain. It was a serious mistake. Just as Americans had wrongly expected Canadians to rebel back in 1812, the British now discovered that Americans would not suddenly switch loyalties either. The Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic coastline, but Lake Champlain became the key weakness in the British invasion plan. Prevost's army depended on supplies moving through the lake. Without naval superiority there, the offensive could not continue safely. On September 11, 1814, British warships attacked an American fleet defending Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain. The Americans had carefully anchored near the shore, forcing the British into a dangerous approach. British commanders expected an easy victory, but instead sailed directly into devastating cannon fire. American guns tore through the attacking fleet. Ships were shattered, sailors thrown into the water, and confusion spread rapidly. Captain George Downie, commander of the British naval force, was killed during the battle. After hours of brutal fighting, the surviving British ships surrendered. The Battle of Plattsburgh destroyed the supply system Prevost needed. Without naval support, continuing the invasion became impossible. He ordered a retreat back into Canada. One of Britain's largest offensives of the war had collapsed almost overnight. At the same time, another British force moved against Baltimore after burning Washington. On September 12, British troops landed at North Point and pushed American defenders backward. The advance succeeded, but Britain suffered a major loss when General Robert Ross, one of their best commanders, was killed by American riflemen. Despite losing Ross, British troops continued toward Baltimore. American defenders withdrew behind the walls of Fort McHenry and prepared for a massive assault. Before dawn on September 13, 1814, the Royal Navy opened fire on the fort. Across nearly 24 continuous hours, British warships launched around 1,500 explosive shells and rockets against the American position. The bombardment was powerful enough to destroy large sections of a city, yet Fort McHenry somehow survived. Smoke covered the harbor while defenders struggled to hold their ground. Surprisingly, casualties inside the fort remained relatively light despite the relentless attack. When morning arrived on September 14th and the smoke finally cleared, the American flag still flew above the fort. One witness, lawyer Francis Scott Key, watched the battle from a nearby ship. Seeing the flag survive inspired him to write a poem about this star-spangled banner. That poem would later become the national anthem of the United States. Britain's failure at Fort McHenry ended the Baltimore campaign. On September 15th, British forces withdrew, abandoning another major offensive against the United States. The Battle of Plattsburgh destroyed the supply network George Prevost needed for his invasion. Without control of Lake Champlain, his army could not safely continue deeper into American territory. Reluctantly, the British commander ordered a full retreat back into Canada. One of Britain's strongest offensives of the war had failed almost overnight. At nearly the same moment, another British army was advancing farther south. After burning Washington, D.C., British troops moved toward Baltimore, one of America's busiest ports. On September 12, 1814, they landed at North Point and quickly forced American defenders backward during fierce fighting outside the city. However, the British victory came with a serious cost. General Robert Ross, one of Britain's most experienced commanders, was shot and killed by American riflemen while leading the advance. His death shocked British troops, but did not stop the operation. Determined to finish the campaign, the army continued marching toward Baltimore itself. Inside the city, American defenders prepared for a desperate stand. Their strongest defensive position was Fort McHenry, which guarded the harbor entrance. If the fort fell, British warships could sail directly into Baltimore and potentially force the city to surrender. Before sunrise on September 13th, the Royal Navy began bombarding Fort McHenry. Massive shells and rockets lit up the sky as British ships unleashed non-stop fire against the American position. The attack continued for almost 24 straight hours, shaking the fort with explosions powerful enough to destroy entire buildings. Despite the overwhelming bombardment, Fort McHenry refused to collapse. Thick smoke covered the harbor while defenders scrambled to repair damage and return fire whenever possible. Many observers expected the fort to surrender before morning, but the American garrison continued resisting through the night. When dawn finally arrived on September 14, 1814, the bombardment stopped and smoke slowly drifted away from Fort McHenry. British commanders expected to see shattered defenses or a white surrender flag above the fort. Instead, the massive American flag still waved over the harbor. The sight became one of the most famous moments in American history. A lawyer named Francis Scott Key had watched the battle from a nearby ship while negotiating for the release of prisoners. Seeing the flag survive inspired him to write a poem celebrating the defense of the fort and the resilience of the United States. That poem, later renamed the Star-Spangled Banner, eventually became the American national anthem. Britain's failure to capture Fort McHenry ended the Baltimore campaign. On September 15th, British forces withdrew, abandoning another major offensive against the United States. In only a few days, America had successfully stopped two separate British invasions in the Northeast. Despite those victories, the overall situation inside the United States remained grim. Morale was still dangerously low. American troops suffered from desertion rates near 12%, and many citizens had lost confidence in the government's ability to continue the war. The administration of President James Madison faced growing political chaos. Secretary of War John Armstrong resigned after widespread criticism of his leadership during the defense of Washington. Financial problems were becoming just as serious. Treasury Secretary George Campbell admitted the nation's finances were collapsing under the pressure of war expenses. By late 1814, the government struggled desperately to raise money. Congress attempted new taxes, loans became harder to secure, and economic disruption spread across the country. Eventually, the United States defaulted on parts of its debt obligations for the first and only time in its history. For many Americans, the final months of 1814 felt like a national disaster. Republican leaders who had supported the war now faced intense public anger. Even politicians who normally opposed higher taxes reluctantly agreed they were necessary just to keep the government functioning. For the Federalist Party, however, the crisis looked like political opportunity. Federalist newspapers argued that the Republicans had dragged the nation into a pointless war against the strongest empire on earth. Their criticism became especially powerful in New England, where opposition to the conflict was strongest. In December 1814, Federalist representatives gathered in Hartford, Connecticut, for a major political convention. The meeting later became known as the Hartford Convention. Delegates harshly criticized President Madison's administration and claimed the war revealed deep problems inside the American political system itself. The convention proposed a dramatic list of constitutional changes. Delegates wanted to remove the Three-Fifths Compromise, which gave slave states additional representation in Congress. They also proposed requiring a supermajority vote for declaring war, limiting presidents to a single term, restricting embargo powers, and preventing the admission of new states without broader approval. To Federalists, these reforms were necessary to stop future political disasters. But critics viewed the convention with suspicion and accused New England politicians of acting disloyal during wartime. Some rumors even claimed Federalists secretly considered breaking away from the Union, though direct evidence remained limited. The final declaration from Hartford was signed and sent toward Washington in January 1815. Yet unknown to the delegates, events unfolding across the Atlantic were already changing everything. Throughout the war, President Madison had continued searching for peace. Earlier attempts at negotiation failed, but by 1814 both Britain and the United States had grown exhausted by years of conflict. American diplomats including John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and Jonathan Russell traveled to the city of Ghent in Belgium to negotiate directly with British representatives. Negotiations in Ghent lasted for months and quickly became tense. Britain entered the talks expecting major concessions from the United States. British diplomats demanded the creation of a permanent Native American territory in the Northwest, restrictions on American military activity around the Great Lakes, and even special trading rights along the Mississippi River. American negotiators refused nearly every demand. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay proved especially stubborn during the discussions. Intelligent, experienced, and unwilling to be intimidated, the American delegation repeatedly blocked British attempts to force humiliating conditions onto the United States. At first, British officials believed time was on their side. They expected future military victories to pressure America into accepting weaker terms. News of Washington burning seemed to support that belief. But then reports from Plattsburgh and Baltimore reached Europe and changed the atmosphere completely. Suddenly, British leaders realized the war might continue far longer than expected while providing little strategic value. After decades of conflict against Napoleon, Britain's government and population were exhausted. Many officials no longer saw any major advantage in prolonging another expensive overseas war against the Americans. Eventually, British negotiators softened their position. By late December 1814, both sides agreed to largely restore conditions to the way they had existed before the war began. On Christmas Eve, the Treaty of Ghent was officially signed. Ironically, the treaty solved almost none of the original issues that had started the conflict. There was no major discussion of impressment, maritime rights, or trade disputes. Both countries mainly wanted peace and a return to stability. But the Atlantic Ocean created one final problem. News traveled slowly in the early 19th century. While diplomats celebrated peace in Belgium, thousands of soldiers in North America had absolutely no idea the war was already over. And in the South, another massive battle was about to begin. Earlier in 1814, British reinforcements had arrived along the Gulf Coast, preparing for operations against the southern United States. British commanders hoped to cooperate with Native American allies and strike American positions across the region. However, recent defeats suffered by Creek forces at Horseshoe Bend weakened those plans significantly. At the same time, Britain used Spanish Florida as a staging area for military operations. Spain and Britain were technically allies against Napoleon, so Spanish officials allowed British troops access to ports like Pensacola. American General Andrew Jackson viewed this as a direct threat. On November 7, 1814, Jackson crossed into Spanish territory with roughly 4,000 soldiers and attacked Pensacola. It marked the first American invasion of Spanish land. The Spanish garrison surrendered after a short fight, partly because local authorities were uncomfortable hosting British forces anyway. British troops and their native allies withdrew from the area with relatively light losses, but Jackson's aggressive action disrupted British plans across the Gulf Coast. More importantly, he now knew where the next attack would come. After leaving Pensacola, Jackson returned to New Orleans and immediately began preparing the city for invasion. Defensive earthworks were built, artillery positions strengthened, and troops organized along likely British approach routes. Jackson understood that New Orleans was one of the most strategically important cities in the United States because it controlled access to the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, British commanders Admiral Alexander Cochrane and General Edward Pakenham prepared their assault force. Even while peace negotiations had technically ended the war in Europe, thousands of British soldiers continued sailing toward Louisiana completely unaware that the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed. On January 8, 1815, British troops advanced toward New Orleans expecting to overwhelm the American defenses quickly. Around 8,000 experienced British soldiers moved across open ground toward Jackson's fortified positions outside the city. Many of them were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars and believed the Americans would collapse under pressure. Instead, they encountered one of the strongest defensive lines of the entire war. Jackson had spent weeks preparing artillery placements, defensive trenches, and barricades. His force included regular soldiers, militia units, frontiersmen, free black troops, Native American allies, and even local pirates led by Jean Lafitte. Though diverse and often poorly equipped, the defenders were positioned extremely well. As British troops advanced, American cannons and rifle fire tore through their formations. The open battlefield left the attackers exposed while muddy terrain slowed movement and created confusion. Officers struggled to maintain order as casualties mounted rapidly. The assault quickly became a disaster for Britain. General Edward Pakenham was killed during the attack, along with several other senior officers. Roughly 300 British soldiers died, more than 1,000 were wounded, and hundreds more were captured. American losses were unbelievably small by comparison, with only a handful killed during the main battle. Before the day ended, the British retreated from the battlefield. The Battle of New Orleans became the most decisive American victory of the entire war and instantly transformed Andrew Jackson into a national hero. Even more important was the timing. News of Jackson's victory reached Washington shortly before. Americans learned about the Treaty of Ghent. To many citizens, it appeared that the United States had forced Britain into peace through military strength, even though the treaty had actually been signed weeks before the battle occurred. The political effect was enormous. Public celebrations erupted across the country, newspapers praised the army, and patriotic enthusiasm replaced the despair that had dominated previous months. The victory at New Orleans completely changed how Americans viewed the war. Just weeks earlier, many citizens believed the country stood on the edge of disaster. Now, national pride surged across the United States. This sudden shift badly damaged the Federalist Party. When delegates from the Hartford Convention arrived with their complaints and proposed constitutional reforms, the public reaction was hostile. Many Americans viewed the Federalists as negative, disloyal, or even borderline traitorous for criticizing the government during wartime. The party's reputation never truly recovered. Over the next several years, the Federalists slowly faded from national politics until disappearing almost entirely. Meanwhile, President James Madison and the Republicans benefited enormously from the new patriotic atmosphere created by the war's ending. In reality, the War of 1812 produced very few direct territorial changes. Borders remained almost exactly the same as before the conflict began. The war also failed to permanently solve many of the maritime disputes that originally caused tensions between Britain and the United States. Yet the conflict still left a lasting impact. The war strengthened American national identity, created famous symbols like the Star-Spangled Banner, elevated Andrew Jackson into political superstardom, and convinced many citizens that the United States could survive a major conflict against one of the world's strongest powers. For Native American nations such as the Creek and Shawnee, however, the consequences were devastating. Their defeats during the war weakened resistance to American expansion across the frontier for decades afterward. Canada was also deeply affected. Victories like Queenston Heights helped shape an early sense of Canadian identity. Many colonists who previously saw themselves mainly as British or French increasingly began identifying as distinctly Canadian. Although often overshadowed by larger wars later in history, the War of 1812 played a major role in shaping North America. Shared hardship, military struggle, and political conflict helped create a stronger sense of unity inside the young United States. As one American congressman later observed, the people now felt and acted far more like a single nation.